Hello everyone, my name's Steve and welcome back to American Steam Legacy. The 282 had been around for almost 3 decades when the United States entered World War I in 1917. While the Mike had suffered a lost decade before the Northern Pacific ordered 20 in 1903, it had made up for lost time by 1917 and had become the mainstay of heavy freight service. So it's no wonder the USRA elected to include the 282 as one of their standardized types. The USRA Mikado has one of the more interesting backstories of the USRA standards. Besides holding the distinction of being the first USRA design to be delivered to a railroad, that first USRA Mikado was also built in record time. Whether the USRA standards were an all-star cast of steam motive power is certainly subject to debate, but the 282 playing a starring role is without question. So coming up next, we'll take a look at the USRA heavy and light Mikados on American Steam Legacy. The story of the USRA 282s begins with one man, one locomotive, and one builder. The man was Michael A. Smith, then president of the New York Central and advisor to the USRA. The builder was the Baldwin Locomotive Works of Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, and the locomotive was Baltimore and Ohio, number 4500. While 4500 deserves its own video, any account of the USRA Mikes wouldn't be complete without it. Mike Smith recommended the USRA order 1,000 Mikados to be kept in a motive power pool to be parsed out to the railroads on an as-needed basis. While the locomotive pool never came to be, plans for what would become the USRA Light Mikado were drawn up. This work began well before plans for the other 5 standard types were finalized, so the USRA Mikes had a bit of a head start. This is where Baldwin comes into the picture. Baldwin's first job was to prepare all of the mechanical drawings needed to build the locomotive. So Baldwin was starting from scratch in some regards. Then all of the patterns, jigs, fixtures, and molds needed to be made. Then came the assembly and testing and delivery of the completed locomotive. According to Baldwin, all of this work was completed in 120 days. From drawings on a drawing board to a complete locomotive ready for service in 4 months. The locomotive we're talking about is the Baltimore and Ohio number 4500, the first of 100 USRA light Mikados the road would receive. When completed on July 4, 1918, number 4500 was built in record time. It also holds the distinction of being the very first USRA designed locomotive delivered to a railroad. Like all USRA standards, the light and heavy Mikes weren't developed from the ground up, starting with a clean sheet of paper. There are 2 likely places the USRA could have looked for a basis design for their light Mikes: the Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe 3160 class of 1917, or the Pennsylvania Railroad's L1S class of 1914. While all 128 Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe machines were built by Baldwin, they arrived rather late and had a rather short service history, if any at all, by the time the USRA developed the Light 282. The Pennsylvania Railroad rostered 574 Mikados by 1917. 205 of them were constructed by Baldwin. The Pennsylvania Railroad Mikes bore the closest resemblance to the USRA Light Mike. Boiler pressure, cylinder dimensions, and driver diameter were all within shouting distance of each other. The difference in firebox heating area can be attributed to the Belpaire firebox featured on the L1s. The USRA's stay-bolted firebox area was 20 feet less, but the grate area for both locomotives was the same. While tractive effort for the USRA Mikes was nearly 7,000 pounds less, the adhesion factor was above the critical number of 4. All of this taken together makes it easy to understand why Baldwin was selected to design and build the first USRA Mikados. Since the Pennsylvania's L1s were Baldwin products, Baldwin still had on file all of the drawings that were prepared for the manufacture of the Pennsylvania order. This greatly expedited the design of the USRA Light Mikes, since many of those drawings could be reissued to the shop or quickly duplicated and revised. The same can be said for the molds, patterns, jigs, and fixtures that were prepared for the L1s. However, there were design elements that were unique to the USRA Light Mikado, so in those cases the Baldwin engineers had to start from scratch. Eventually, the USRA turned its attention to the heavy variant of the 282. The inspiration for the standard heavy Mike came from the El Paso and Southwestern 282s of 1914. The USRA Heavy bears far more resemblance to the El Paso machines than that of the light Mike to the Pennsy. The driver diameter not only had commonality with the El Pasos, but also with the USRA light Mikados. The differences in boiler pressure, cylinder diameter, and firebox area apparently evened out, resulting in nearly identical tractive effort to the El Paso machines. Engine weight was kept reasonable for a locomotive of this type, allowing it to operate on 100 pound per yard rail. Since the heavy Mikado could tread lightly, its route availability on most railroads was greatly increased. Once the USRA Mikes began appearing on U.S. railroads, they were given the same reception as other standard locomotives of the USRA and received the typical feedback. Praise was usually muted, and the complaints were all over the place. A few were legitimate, but most were rooted in finding fault just for the sake of having something to complain about, or just a case of sour grapes. Praise for the USRA Mikados was largely centered around performance. Fuel efficiency, steaming capacity, overall utility, and ride quality were frequently cited. Build quality and overall layout of appliances also drew recognition. When it came to complaints, the nickel plate road was probably the most vocal. The USRA received a list of 21 complaints from the nickel plate, and as usual, some were valid, others were very much otherwise. One of the more onerous was a claim that the sandboxes sweat due to a lack of ventilation. No other road is known to have had this issue, but the real whopper pertained to the adhesion factor for the light mic. The nickel plate insisted the adhesion factor should have been 4.04 instead of 4.01. Talk about splitting hairs. It was general policy for the USRA to consider complaints on their own merit, as well as the number of railroads making the same complaint. If only one railroad was raising an issue, the USRA assumed it probably had no merit. But if multiple roads were pointing out the same issue, it may have been worth looking into. With all that being said, it didn't always result in corrective action from the USRA. But the one shortcoming of the USRA Mikes that was valid and should have been addressed by the USRA had to do with the combustion chambers. Several roads reported cracks developing or the riveted seams losing their watertight integrity. The USRA never provided a comment or guidance for rectifying this issue. The USRA Mikado being the most produced of all the USRA standards might at least partially explain why it received the most feedback, both good and bad. 858 USRA light and heavy Mikados were built in 1918, with many more copies being ordered after the end of USRA control in 1920. The six-coupled switcher came in a distant second at 402 units produced, and no copies were ordered during the interwar years. Whether the USRA enhanced the reputation of the 282 or damaged it is certainly open for debate, but no one could argue the Mike's value as a heavy freight hauler. Fortunately, there are several 282s that have been preserved, and some trace their lineage back to the USRA design. I hope you enjoyed the video. Please remember to like, share, and subscribe. And once again, my name's Steve, and thanks for watching. I'll see you next time.